Section 1. The show that spoke in code. There is something about Family Guy that most people who watched it casually never quite picked up on. And that something is this. A significant number of its episodes, across all of its many seasons, were never really about what they appeared to be about on the surface. They were doing something underneath the jokes. Something quiet, something pointed, something that the show's creators either could not say plainly because a network would not allow it, or chose not to say plainly because the show's format gave them a more interesting way in. Family Guy, when it premiered on the 31st of January 1999, immediately after Super Bowl 33, drew around 22 million viewers in its first broadcast. That is an enormous number for any show, let alone an animated comedy about a bumbling father in a fictional Rhode Island town. And right away, even in that very first episode, the show was doing something more complicated than it appeared. It was wrapped in jokes. It was wrapped in cutaways and absurdity and cartoon silliness. But underneath all of that, it was making arguments. It was taking positions. It was commenting on things that mattered to the people who made it, and it was doing so through a medium that gave them cover. Because when something is a cartoon, when it is clearly ridiculous, when a talking dog is on screen and a baby is building laser weapons in his crib, people tend to let their guard down. They stop bracing for a message. They stop waiting to be taught something. And that is exactly when the show would slide something real underneath the door. This is not a coincidence. Seth MacFarlane, who created the show while still in his mid-20s after studying animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, came up through a tradition of animated storytelling that understood the power of the form. Cartoons have always been able to go places that live action could not. They existed in a slightly unreal register that gave audiences permission to laugh at things they might bristle at in a drama. And MacFarlane, along with the writing teams he assembled over the years, used that permission constantly, sometimes consciously, sometimes instinctively, sometimes in ways that the network only figured out after the episode had already aired and it was too late to do anything about it. What we are going to do tonight is go through those episodes, the ones that had a second conversation running underneath the first one, the ones where the jokes were real but they were also a delivery system for something the writers actually wanted to say. We are going to go slowly through each one, through the context that produced them, through what was happening in the country and in the writer's room at the time, through what the episode actually communicates when you strip away the cartoon absurdity and look at the bones underneath. Some of these hidden messages are political. Some of them are deeply personal, drawn from the real experiences and beliefs of the people who wrote them. Some of them were put there deliberately with full intention, as acts of creative defiance against censors or network executives or the culture at large. And some of them emerged almost accidentally, as the show processed the fears and frustrations of the people making it, and those thoughts found their way into the writing in ways that nobody fully planned. We are going to move through all of it tonight. Every major category of hidden message the show ever deployed. Every episode that was quietly about something bigger than its plot description suggested. And by the time we are done, the show you thought you knew will look different. Not worse, just deeper, just more deliberate, just more interesting. So get comfortable, let the background noise of it settle around you, and let yourself drift into it slowly because this one takes a while. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you are enjoying this and want more deep dives like it, the subscribe button is right there and it is completely free. Section 2. The DNA of the thing. How the show was built to carry messages. Before we go into specific episodes, we have to understand something about how Family Guy was constructed, because the structure of the show itself is not neutral. The way it is put together, the actual mechanical format of a Family Guy episode, was designed in a way that made hiding a message inside it surprisingly easy. And understanding that design tells you a lot about why so many episodes ended up functioning as something more than their surface content. The most famous element of the show's format is the cutaway gag. A character says something and the show cuts to a short, unrelated scene that illustrates or comments on what was just said. The scene plays out for anywhere from a few seconds to well over a minute, and then the show cuts back to wherever it was. This format, which MacFarlane and his writers developed from the earliest episodes and which became the show's signature comedic device, is often discussed in terms of how it changed comedy and how it was later overused, and how it influenced internet clip culture and YouTube sharing. All of that is true. But there is something else about the cutaway format that is less often talked about, The cutaway is a mechanism of indirection. When a character in an episode says something provocative and the show cuts away to a joke about it, the joke absorbs some of the heat that the original statement might have generated. The criticism lands, but it lands softly, wrapped in laughter. The audience processes the point through the pleasure of the joke rather than through the discomfort of having been directly addressed. This is an old rhetorical technique, the kind that comedians and satirists have used for centuries. You say the hard thing, but you say it funny, and the laughter lets people receive it who might otherwise have closed the door. Family Guy did this constantly. When the show wanted to say something about government policy, it did not write a speech. It had Peter stumble into a situation that made the policy absurd. When it wanted to criticize the media, it did not editorialize. It showed Tom Tucker delivering obviously skewed news with a straight face and trusted the audience to clock the gap between what was being said and what was real. When it wanted to talk about religion or race or gender or class, it built those conversations into the fabric of an apparently ridiculous storyline and let them breathe there, protected by the ambient comedy of everything around them. This is also connected to the show's character design in a way that matters. The Griffin family was built to be a cross-section of American life, and each character was designed to carry certain arguments by proxy. Peter is working class, not particularly educated, prone to impulse and stubbornness, and a deep susceptibility to whatever authority figure or media voice is currently speaking to him. That is not an accident. That is a portrait of a specific kind of American voter, a specific kind of American father, and the show's comedy around Peter has always been partly about the discomfort of watching someone with that profile navigate a world that has grown too complicated for the assumptions he was raised with. Brian is the show's resident liberal intellectual, or at least its resident person who believes himself to be a liberal intellectual, and the comedy around him has always been partly about the gap between what people believe about themselves and how they actually behave. He talks about high culture and progressive politics and careful thinking while being a drunk who chases younger women and struggles to finish a novel. The show's early seasons used this gap as gentle, affectionate comedy. Later seasons, as we will discuss, used it with more edge. But in both registers, Brian exists to carry a critique. He is the show's argument about the limits of self-proclaimed sophistication. Stewie in his original form is a kind of compressed satire of ambition itself, a baby who wants to rule the world, who builds weapons in his crib and speaks like a Bond villain. There is something specific being said in that character about the grandiosity of certain kinds of ego, the absurdity of power-seeking, the comedy of total ruthlessness attached to something as helpless and small as an infant. The joke runs deeper than it first appears. Lois is the competence at the center of a household that would collapse without her, and the show has used her across its run to make arguments about the invisible labor of wives and mothers, the way that competence in women goes unnoticed until it disappears, and the complicated dynamics of a marriage between a patient, capable person and a reckless, impulsive one. Even Meg, the most obviously abused character in the show's history, has always functioned as a message carrier. What the show did with Meg, the trajectory of her treatment across the seasons, is itself one of the show's hidden messages, even if it is a message the show did not intend to send in the way it was ultimately received. The structure of a typical Family Guy episode also tends to follow a pattern that is ideally suited to social commentary. Something in the normal world goes wrong. That wrongness escalates. The escalation reveals something absurd or terrible about how the world actually works. A resolution is reached, sometimes satisfying and sometimes deliberately unsatisfying, and the audience is left with a feeling about something real. The comedy is real. The entertainment is real. But so is the underlying mechanism. What made this approach work so well in the early seasons, and what distinguished the best episodes of the show across its entire run, is that the writers were not content to simply gesture at a topic. They were willing to go somewhere with it, to follow the logic of a premise into territory that was genuinely uncomfortable, to let their characters be wrong in specific, instructive ways, and to trust the audience to feel the difference between the surface joke and the real thing underneath. That trust, that belief that the audience was paying enough attention to receive both levels of a given episode simultaneously, is maybe the most underrated quality the show had in its best years. It is also the quality that eroded most visibly as the series went on, as cutaways got longer and storylines got thinner and the show increasingly chose the easier, louder kind of comedy over the kind that had something underneath it. But the capacity was always there. And in certain episodes, in certain seasons, that capacity was deployed with a precision that is genuinely impressive. Those are the episodes we are here to talk about. The first season of Family Guy began with an episode that looked like straightforward farce. Peter loses his job, lies about it, commits welfare fraud, and eventually has to confess. It is played for laughs. It is full of cutaways and cartoon chaos. But the episode that aired on the 31st of January 1999, as millions of Super Bowl viewers idly left their televisions on after the game, was doing something more than it appeared. And to understand what, you have to understand the specific historical moment it was born into. Section 3. Death Has a Shadow, the first hidden message the show ever sent. The late 1990s in America were a strange and specific time to be a working-class family. The country was in the middle of an economic expansion that produced significant wealth, and that wealth was visible and discussed constantly in the culture. The stock market was doing things that had never been done before. Technology companies were growing faster than anyone could track. The national conversation was full of the language of prosperity and opportunity, and the sense that anyone paying attention could participate in the upswing. And underneath all of that, quietly, the working-class communities that Family Guy was made about and made for were experiencing something different. The toy factory where Peter Griffin worked in Season 1, the happily-go-lucky toy factory, was not chosen at random. Manufacturing jobs in America were under sustained pressure throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Union membership was declining. The kind of stable, benefits-bearing, blue-collar employment that had supported families like the Griffins for generations in places like Rhode Island was becoming harder to find and harder to keep. The cultural conversation about this reality was muted compared to the breathless optimism about tech and markets that dominated the media. Into this context, Family Guy dropped its first episode. And the first thing that episode does before anything else happens, before a single cutaway fires, is establish Peter Griffin's economic situation. He works at a factory. He struggles to make ends meet. He drinks too much because the pressure of his life is something he does not quite have the tools to process. And when he loses his job, the first thing his brain goes to, the literal first alternative he considers when Brian uses the word, is welfare. Now here is what the episode does with that. It does not moralize about welfare. It does not frame it as shameful or as a last resort to be avoided at all costs. What it does is show the system working in a way that is simultaneously absurd and revealing. Peter walks into a government office. A processing error gives him a check for $150,000 a week. He spends that money. He throws it from a blimp over the Super Bowl. He ends up in court. The joke is about the error and the excess and the cartoon chaos of it all. But what the episode is actually showing, in the bones of its story, is a system so bureaucratically chaotic that a working-class man who needs a small amount of help to bridge a gap between jobs can accidentally receive a fortune, spend it in a way that immediately makes him a criminal, and end up before a judge facing consequences for something that was essentially the government's own mistake. The joke is on the system, not on Peter, not on the idea of welfare itself. This is a meaningful distinction that the late 1990s mainstream media discourse rarely drew. The political conversation around welfare in that era was dominated by the aftermath of the 1996 welfare reform legislation, which had fundamentally restructured government assistance programs with a set of assumptions built into it about who needed help, why they needed it, and how much trust they deserved. The dominant narrative framed welfare as a trap, as a handout, as something that needed to be constrained and time-limited and conditioned on behavior. Family Guy's first episode pushed back on this, quietly, through comedy. It showed a man who needed help, an imperfect man with genuine flaws, accessing a system that was supposed to exist for people like him. The absurdity of what happened was not a comment on the man or on the idea of assistance. It was a comment on the way the system worked, or failed to work, when a real person encountered it. The episode ends with the judge letting Peter off. Lois tells Peter that what he did was wrong, not because of the welfare fraud itself, but because he lied to her and betrayed her trust. And Peter immediately pivots to suggesting a minority scholarship as his next scheme, which is played as a quick joke before the credits roll. But even that joke carries something. The rapid pivot from one scheme to the next, the catalog of ways a desperate person might try to access resources they do not have, speaks to something real about the experience of financial precarity that the show was born out of. The writers of early Family Guy, who included Chris Sheridan and Danny Smith and Gary Janetti, among others, came from backgrounds that were not those of the Hollywood elite. They understood what it meant to struggle with money. They understood what it meant to feel like the system was designed for other people, and you were perpetually trying to find a door into it. And that understanding showed up in the show's first episode, wrapped in jokes about blimp flights and cartoon judges, but there underneath all of it. There is also something worth noting about the timing. The Super Bowl placement of the pilot episode meant that the first people to watch Family Guy were not the show's intended audience. They were the mass American television audience, millions of people who had just watched a football game and had not chosen this show. They stumbled into it, and what they got was a show that, in its very first 22 minutes, made a joke out of a genuine social program that a significant percentage of Americans had used or needed or had complicated feelings about. That was a choice. A deliberate, somewhat brave choice for a brand new show with no established audience yet. The show's second season included an episode called Holy Crap, in which Peter's deeply religious father, Francis Griffin, comes to visit. Francis is critical and judgmental and has a specific, rigid, and harsh version of Catholicism that he applies to everything in his life and everything in the lives of the people around him. The episode explores the way that certain kinds of religious belief function not as comfort or community, but as a tool of control and judgment. It makes fun of Francis. But it also, quietly, shows Peter navigating the experience of having been raised by someone whose love was always conditional on compliance, and the way that kind of upbringing shapes a person even decades later. This was the show's first season still. 2 episodes in, and it was already laying the groundwork for a hidden conversation about generational trauma, about the way parents' beliefs and behaviors write themselves into their children, about the comedy and the sadness of trying to be different from the person who raised you while still carrying everything they put in you. The pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow, also introduced the show's first recurring structural hidden message. The first 4 episodes of the show's first season have titles that form a sentence when read together. Death Has a Shadow. I Never Met the Dead Man. Chitty Chitty Death Bang. Mind Over Murder. This has been noted by various fans over the years, and while its intentionality is debated, its existence is real. The writers of the show were playing games from day one, putting things in that would reward the people paying close attention, layering their content in ways that the casual viewer would never notice and the dedicated one would be rewarded for. That instinct, that layering instinct, that belief that the show should work on more than one level simultaneously, is the engine behind everything we are about to go through. Section 4. PTV and the free speech episode when the show went to war with its own network. In 2004, Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction at the Super Bowl halftime show triggered one of the most significant regulatory overreactions in the history of American broadcast television. The Federal Communications Commission, which had been relatively quiet on indecency enforcement, suddenly began generating enormous fines and threatening broadcast licenses over content that, by almost any reasonable standard, was no more explicit than what had been on television for decades. The Parents Television Council, a conservative media watchdog group that had already developed a specific and intense hatred for Family Guy, filed over 540,000 complaints with the FCC in the months following the Super Bowl incident, most of them generated by an organized campaign. This complaint campaign represented a significant portion of all the FCC complaints received in those years. Seth MacFarlane, who had already been fighting with Fox's internal censors over what could and could not appear in Family Guy episodes, watched all of this happen with what he later described, not gently, as rage. His show had been canceled twice by that point, partly due to the ongoing campaign against it. He had been watching organizations like the Parents Television Council treat his work as a genuine threat to American children and families. He had been watching the FCC become increasingly responsive to coordinated complaint campaigns, rather than to any consistent standard of what constituted harmful content. And in 2005, when Family Guy came back for its 4th season, he wrote an episode about all of it. The episode is called PTV, and it aired on the 6th of November 2005. In it, a wardrobe malfunction at the Emmy Awards triggers an FCC crackdown on television content. The FCC, which the show depicts with Cobra Commander from G.I. Joe as its chairman, begins censoring increasingly absurd things. Peter, in response, starts his own cable channel called PTV, which he broadcasts from his home and on which he airs completely uncensored content, including things that the Fox censors had previously cut from Family Guy episodes. The FCC then extends its censorship beyond television and into real life, sending agents to bleep out conversations and cover up naturally occurring things the commission has decided are indecent. This is funny. It is also a very specific and fairly sophisticated argument about free speech and the nature of censorship. The episode makes a point that is harder to make in a serious format. That censorship, once it begins operating without a clear and consistent principle, tends to expand. The line between protecting audiences from genuinely harmful content and suppressing creative expression through the mechanism of governmental pressure is one that gets moved repeatedly in the history of media regulation, and it rarely moves in the direction of more speech. The show made this argument in 22 minutes of animation, with a song called The Freakin' FCC, sung by Peter, Stewie, and Brian in lingerie, and it got its argument across with remarkable clarity. MacFarlane confirmed in a recorded panel discussion that the episode was written out of direct, personal frustration with the censorship environment that followed the Super Bowl incident. He said it explicitly, "It came out of rage." The episode is therefore one of the clearest cases in the show's history of a hidden message that is not particularly hidden at all, because the target of the satire is right there on the screen. But what makes it worth discussing in depth is the way the show's format made the argument more effectively than a more conventional approach would have. The episode's climax involves the Griffin family traveling to Washington and convincing Congress to reverse the FCC's new rules. This is absurd. Congress does not work that way. A family from Rhode Island does not go to Washington and fix media regulation in a single afternoon. But the absurdity is the point. The show is arguing that the solution to regulatory overreach is pushback from the people affected by it, and it dramatizes that argument in the most cartoonishly simplified way possible, precisely because the simplification makes the underlying principle legible to the widest possible audience. What the episode communicates, when you follow its logic all the way through, is something like this. Censorship always claims to be protecting someone from harm. It almost always ends up protecting someone from discomfort. Those are not the same thing, and the mechanism by which the first becomes the second is usually the organized pressure of a small, highly motivated group presenting itself as the representative voice of a much larger, quieter population that has not actually asked for this protection. The Parents Television Council represented a small fraction of American television viewers. Its complaint campaigns generated enormous FCC responses, because the FCC was structured in a way that made quantity of complaints a significant factor in its enforcement decisions. The show knew this, and it said so, in a catchy song, in a cartoon, on a Sunday night on Fox. There is also a layer to PTV that goes beyond the immediate political argument. The episode, in having Peter build and operate his own network outside of the regulatory structure, is making an argument about the relationship between creative people and the institutions that broadcast their work. The network, in this metaphor, is not a neutral distributor. It is a gatekeeper with its own pressures and priorities, and those pressures often have nothing to do with the quality or value of the creative work in question. MacFarlane had experienced this directly with the 2 cancellations of Family Guy, both of which were driven by Fox's business decisions and scheduling choices, rather than by any assessment of the show's creative merit. The episode's fantasy of a creator just going around the system entirely and talking directly to the audience without institutional mediation is a wish-fulfillment fantasy drawn from real frustration. It also interestingly predicted something real. The next decade would see the rise of YouTube, then streaming platforms, then creator-direct content distribution in ways that genuinely did erode the power of traditional broadcast gatekeepers. The show imagined a future that was coming, filtered through the specific anxieties of a network creator who had been canceled and censored and harassed by watchdog groups, and made it funny. But the argument underneath the funny was serious and was coming from a real place. The Parents Television Council responded to PTV by filing 188,000 FCC complaints about it. This is a fact that requires a moment of appreciation. The show made an episode criticizing the Parents Television Council for filing FCC complaints, and in response, the Parents Television Council filed 188,000 FCC complaints about that episode. MacFarlane later told Advocate magazine that being the PTC's biggest target was something he was proud of, and compared receiving their criticism to getting hate mail from an organization that spent its entire day hating people. The episode had done what it set out to do. It had made its argument. It had made the other side's response part of the argument's evidence. And it had done all of it while Peter Griffin was singing in lingerie about government censors. Section 5. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, the episode that Fox buried for 3 years. The first episode of Family Guy that Fox refused to air was called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and it was produced in 2000 as part of the show's 3rd season. Fox held it for 3 years. Adult Swim finally aired it in 2003, during the period when the show was off the air and airing only in reruns. Fox eventually broadcast it in 2004. The episode sat in a drawer for 3 years because the network believed its content might be perceived as anti-Semitic. To understand why that is interesting rather than simply concerning, you have to understand what the episode is actually doing. Peter Griffin, struggling with his finances, becomes convinced that what he needs is a Jewish financial advisor because he holds the stereotype that Jewish people are naturally good with money. He finds a man named Max Weinstein, who is in fact an accountant and who is in fact skilled at managing finances. Max helps Peter significantly. Peter then decides that he wants Chris to become Jewish, because he believes being Jewish will give Chris the same financial acumen that he imagines is intrinsic to Jewish identity. The episode is making a joke about anti-Semitic stereotypes by showing the person who holds them. Peter's logic is both transparently absurd and recognizably real. The idea that Jewish people have a special, intrinsic relationship with money is one of the oldest and most persistent anti-Semitic tropes in Western history, and it is one that persists even in populations that would not describe themselves as anti-Semitic. The episode confronts that trope by following its logic through to its natural conclusion, which is absurd, and by showing the person who holds that belief as the joke rather than the group the belief is about. This is a technique called satirical inversion, and it has a long and complicated history in comedy. The risk with it is always the same. If the audience receives the satire without processing the inversion, if they hear the joke without understanding that they are supposed to be laughing at the person making the assumption rather than at the group being stereotyped, the satire becomes what it was trying to criticize. Fox's concern about the episode was, at its core, a concern that the show's audience might not be sophisticated enough to receive the inversion correctly. That concern is not unreasonable. It is also, from a creative standpoint, a genuinely frustrating one, because it assumes the worst about the audience and uses that assumption to suppress content that was made with real care and real intention. What the episode is actually doing at its deepest level is something more interesting than a simple joke about stereotypes. It is showing that even someone who holds prejudiced beliefs does not hold them out of malice. Peter is not a hateful person. He is an ignorant one, which is a different thing, and the episode is asking its audience to hold that distinction in mind. He encounters a real Jewish person, Max Weinstein, who is kind and helpful and who relates to Peter as a person rather than as a stereotype. The friendship that develops between them is genuine, and through that friendship, the episode argues that the path out of prejudice is not condemnation but contact, not punishment for bad beliefs but exposure to the real people those beliefs reduce. This is a more sophisticated argument than the episode gets credit for, partly because the 3-year delay in its broadcast meant that by the time it actually aired, the conversation around it was mostly about whether it should have been suppressed rather than about what it was saying. The suppression itself became the story, which is a shame because the episode deserved a better conversation than the one it got. The episode also features a musical number in which Peter, accompanied by a Jewish cantor, sings about his admiration for Jewish people in a way that is exaggerated to the point of absurdity. The song is funny precisely because of how far it goes, because the exaggeration of the reverence makes the reverence itself look like another form of the same reductiveness as the prejudice. Treating a group of people as mystically talented or specially gifted is not admiration. It is just a positive valence version of the same essentialism that produces negative stereotypes. The show understood this, and it put the understanding into a song that it knew Fox would probably be uncomfortable with, and it turned out it was right about that. 3 years in a drawer, then a bootleg circuit, then a gradual, quiet official release. The episode found its audience eventually, but the delay is itself a data point about what happens when a network's commercial anxieties come into contact with a creative team's willingness to go somewhere uncomfortable in service of something true. Section 6. The episode America never saw partial terms of endearment. Of all the episodes Family Guy ever produced, the most thoroughly suppressed, the one that remains to this day unavailable on any major American streaming platform, is the 8th season finale titled Partial Terms of Endearment. It was produced in 2010. Fox refused to air it before season 8 even began broadcasting. Adult Swim refused to air it. It has never been available on Hulu, which is the show's primary American streaming home. It is not on Disney+. It exists in the United States primarily as a standalone DVD release from 2010 and on certain international streaming platforms. It aired in the United Kingdom. The BBC broadcast it in its primetime slot. It was seen by just under 1 million British households. Critics there received it positively. Fox president Kevin Reilly explained the decision to ban it with a statement that is worth quoting carefully. He said the subject matter was an extremely fragile one, at an extremely fragile economic time. He said abortion was the one issue that seemed most likely to cause trouble. He acknowledged that the episode handled the material well. He said it simply was not worth the risk. The episode itself follows Lois Griffin, who agrees to be a surrogate mother for an old college friend named Naomi and her husband Dale. While Lois is pregnant, Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident. Lois must decide what to do. She can carry the pregnancy to term and put the baby up for adoption. She can terminate it. Peter, who is initially supportive of Lois being a surrogate, comes under the influence of anti-abortion activists and reverses his position, delivering increasingly extreme anti-abortion arguments in increasingly absurd ways. The episode ends with Lois having an abortion. The final scene is the family at dinner. Lois mentions a wonderful new member of the family. Before she can finish, Peter turns to the camera and says they had the abortion, ending the episode immediately. What is the hidden message here? The message that Fox found too risky to broadcast in the United States? The episode does not take a simple position on abortion. It takes a position on something adjacent and in some ways more fundamental, the question of who gets to make this decision and on what basis. Lois goes through a genuine, depicted process of moral deliberation. She does not arrive at her decision quickly or easily. The show does not present her as obviously right. It does not present the decision as consequence-free, but it does present it as hers to make, and it presents Peter's attempt to override that decision through the mechanism of external ideological pressure as both absurd and wrong. The absurdity of Peter's anti-abortion conversion is the episode's sharpest blade. He goes from casually supportive to fervently opposed in the span of watching a single activist video, and his opposition is based entirely on emotional messaging, rather than on any engagement with Lois's actual situation. The show is arguing that a significant proportion of political opposition to abortion rights operates through exactly this mechanism: emotional activation based on ideological messaging, disconnected from the real circumstances of real women in real situations. It is doing this with Peter Griffin as the vehicle, which means it is doing it in a way that is funny and that makes its argument without the lecture quality that would make it easy to dismiss. The ending, where Peter breaks the fourth wall to announce the abortion as if wrapping up the storyline, is worth thinking about for a moment. It is doing several things at once. It is reminding the audience that they are watching a cartoon, which undercuts any reading of the episode as propaganda. It is pointing out that in the world of the show, Lois made her decision and the family moved forward, which is what happens in the real world far more often than the surrounding political debate acknowledges. And it is doing so with the total deflation of comedy, the announcement of something the political conversation treats as enormous delivered in the flattest possible register, which is itself an argument about proportion and about the way the discourse around this topic often makes the political stakes overwhelm the human reality. Fox's stated reason for suppressing the episode was financial, not moral. Kevin Reilly explicitly said it was not worth the risk, meaning not worth the risk of advertiser pressure and viewer complaint, and the sustained negative attention that a network airing an episode explicitly depicting an abortion might attract in the American cultural climate of 2010. This is honest, at least. He was not pretending the episode was bad television. He was saying that the business environment made it too costly to broadcast. This is a specific and important form of censorship, one that does not operate through government enforcement or explicit policy, but through the commercial incentives that shape what content is and is not viable for a major broadcast network. What happened to the episode afterward is also revealing. It sat in a drawer the way When You Wish Upon a Weinstein sat in a drawer, except it never got the gradual release that the earlier episode eventually received. Years later, when Disney acquired the Fox Entertainment assets and Family Guy moved into their portfolio, the episode became even less accessible on American streaming platforms. The quiet removal of it from availability is itself a continuation of the argument the episode was making about whose comfort gets prioritized, about what the market will and will not allow, about the gap between what is legal and what is accessible and what that gap means for the cultural conversation around difficult topics. The episode exists. It is good television. By the account of critics who saw the UK broadcast and reviewers who bought the DVD, it is one of the more thoughtfully constructed episodes in the show's history. It is also, in 2026, essentially invisible to the American streaming audience. That invisibility is a hidden message in itself, sent not by the writers but by the institutions that control the distribution of the work. Section 7. Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, the Atheism episode and what it was really saying. Season 7, Episode 11, originally aired the 29th of March, 2009, written by Danny Smith. This is one of the episodes that generated the most straightforward controversy during its broadcast run, and also one of the most misread episodes in the show's history. The surface plot is fairly simple. Meg contracts the mumps after being pushed into someone at a Star Trek convention. Bedridden and feverish, she has access to only one television channel, the Religion Channel, where Kirk Cameron is preaching. Meg becomes a born-again Christian. She begins evangelizing. She tries to convert Brian, who is an atheist. When Brian refuses to convert, Meg exposes his atheism publicly. The town of Quahog, which generally regards atheists as worse than criminals, turns on Brian. He is banned from every bar and convenience store in town. Desperate for alcohol, Brian fakes a religious conversion. Meg takes him to church. Eventually, Brian can no longer sustain the pretense, and he gives a speech to Meg in which he uses her own difficult life circumstances as evidence against the existence of a benevolent God, reducing her to tears and sending her back to her prior, less faith-centered existence. Critics at the time largely read this as a pro-atheism episode, and many religious commentators criticized it on exactly those grounds. Brian wins the argument. Brian is the character the show most consistently frames as being correct about intellectual matters. Therefore, the show is saying atheism is right and religion is wrong. This reading misses several things. First, the episode is not structured to vindicate Brian. The episode is structured to show Brian being a jerk. His speech to Meg at the end, the one that destroys her faith, does so by attacking her personal pain rather than by making a careful philosophical argument. He essentially says, "Look at how miserable your life is. If God existed and loved you, your life would not be this miserable. Therefore, God does not exist. This is not good atheism. It is cruel. It uses a vulnerable person's suffering as a rhetorical weapon. The show knows this. The show has Brian know it too, or at least has the discomfort of the scene register as something other than a triumphant moment. Second, Meg's brief religious phase is depicted, before Brian's intervention, as something that is genuinely helping her. The church makes her feel accepted. It gives her community and purpose and a sense that she belongs somewhere. These are real and significant things, particularly for someone like Meg, whose home life offers her almost none of them. The show does not mock these benefits. It shows them as real. Brian takes them away, and the episode acknowledges that something has been lost in that. Third, the episode's actual target is not religion. It is intolerance. The town of Quahog's reaction to Brian's atheism, the banning from bars and stores, the social ostracism, the treatment of atheism as worse than virtually any other category of person, is the episode's real subject. This is a depiction of the specific social reality faced by atheists in many parts of the United States, where polls throughout the 2000s consistently showed atheists to be among the least trusted and least socially accepted minority groups in the country. The show is not saying religion is bad. It is saying that using religious identity as a criterion for social exclusion is bad, and that this is something that happens to atheists in America with a frequency and intensity that the mainstream conversation rarely acknowledges. The episode is also doing something subtle, with Meg's role in it that rewards close reading. Meg, who has spent most of her time on the show being tormented and belittled, finds in religion a context in which she feels valued and capable and heard. She becomes, briefly, someone with conviction and purpose. And her actions in exposing Brian's atheism, while not justified, come from a real place. She believes something is true and important, and she wants Brian to have access to it. This is not the behavior of a villain. It is the behavior of a person whose own desperate need for connection has been given a particular shape by a particular community. Brian destroys that. He does it in the name of honesty and intellectual integrity, and those are real values. But the way he exercises them is not honest or intellectually careful. It is vengeful, and it is targeted at a person who cannot easily defend herself. The episode ends with Meg worse off than she started, which is the show's real conclusion. A cycle of harm completed, a vulnerable person's one source of comfort stripped away by someone who told himself he was doing it for good reasons. This is a darker and more complicated hidden message than the episode gets credit for. It is not a defense of atheism. It is a meditation on the way that intellectual conviction, divorced from care for the person in front of you, can be as destructive as any other form of cruelty. The episode also features a subplot in which Stewie travels to the set of Star Trek: The Next Generation and abducts the cast, which functions partly as a kind of palate cleanser for the more uncomfortable main plot, and partly as a showcase for the show's willingness to go to completely absurd places in the middle of a serious story. This tonal flexibility, the ability to hold comedy and discomfort in the same episode without either canceling the other out, is one of the things that distinguished the show when it was operating at its best. Section 8. Brian and Stewie, the Vault, the Gun, and the Conversation About Living. The 2nd of May, 2010. Season 8. Episode 17. Written by Gary Janetti. Directed by Dominic Bianchi. The 150th episode of Family Guy, which was given a special half-hour format in recognition of the milestone. There are no cutaway gags in this episode. Not one. For a show that had made the cutaway gag its signature form and had, by its 8th season, become substantially dependent on it, the absence is jarring. It is meant to be jarring. The episode begins when Brian and Stewie are accidentally locked inside a bank vault over a weekend. There is no other story. There is no B-plot. There is no alternate family storyline running parallel. For 30 minutes, it is just two characters in a room, talking. What happens in that room is extraordinary by the standards of what Family Guy was doing at that point in its history. Stewie soils his diaper. There is significant unpleasant comedy around this situation that we do not need to linger on, and then the show finds the gun. Brian has a gun in his safety deposit box. Stewie finds it curious that Brian, a known gun control advocate who cried after the Columbine massacre, owns a handgun. Brian does not want to talk about it. Eventually he does. He keeps the gun in case he ever wants to commit suicide. He has a bottle of scotch in the box alongside it, intended to be his last drink before he uses the gun. He explains that his life feels like too much. That Stewie was right, in a conversation they had earlier in the episode, when he said Brian lacked purpose, that he cannot find meaning, that the struggle of his daily existence, the failed novel, the unrealized ambitions, the sense that he is forever a supporting character in a life he wanted to be the protagonist of, has accumulated into something he no longer knows how to carry. Stewie's response to this revelation is one of the most quietly affecting things the show ever produced. He does not deliver a speech. He does not offer solutions. He says he does not want Brian to kill himself because Brian is the only person in the world who really understands him. That Brian gives Stewie's life purpose in the way that nothing else does. He asks Brian to read to him, which Brian does, and they wait together until morning when the vault opens. What is the hidden message in Brian and Stewie? The episode is a portrait of depression that is more accurate and more compassionate than most primetime television has ever managed to be. Brian's suicidal ideation is not dramatized for shock value. It is not played for laughs, which would have been the easy choice and the wrong one. It is presented as something that has been living quietly inside the character for a long time, something he has been carrying so privately that the closest person in his life does not know about it. The vault functions as a metaphor for the disclosure itself. The two of them are trapped in a closed space together, the hiding has nowhere to go, and the truth emerges not because Brian decides to share it, but because the circumstances make concealment impossible. This is often how these conversations happen in real life. Not because someone decides the moment is right, because the circumstances remove the option to keep the door closed. Stewie's response, too, is quietly instructive. He does not immediately know what to say. He sits with the information. He expresses his own need for Brian in a way that is honest rather than performative. He does not minimize or dismiss or reframe. He says, in essence, that Brian matters to him, and that this mattering is itself a reason to stay. Not a grand philosophical argument. Not a lecture about the value of life. Just, you matter to me and I need you here. Psychology Today magazine actually wrote about this episode when it aired, noting what it did right and what it did wrong in terms of depicting how to respond to someone who has disclosed suicidal ideation. The article was written by a clinical psychologist specializing in suicide prevention. The fact that a clinical psychologist was writing about a Family Guy episode in Psychology Today says something about how seriously the episode was taken by people whose work involves this subject. The episode aired at a moment, 2010, when public conversation about mental health, depression, and suicide was less developed and less normalized than it would gradually become over the following decade. The show put this conversation on primetime network television, in an animated format without flinching, and trusted its audience to receive it. The absence of cutaway gags in the episode is the formal expression of that trust. This is a conversation that cannot be interrupted. This is a story that cannot be lightened by jumping to something else for 20 seconds. We are staying here, in this vault, with these two characters, because what is happening between them is too important to be treated as setup for a gag. That formal choice, that decision to remove the show's signature device entirely for the most serious episode it ever produced, is itself a message. It says, the things we are about to discuss are real. The techniques we normally use to manage the discomfort of real things have been put away. We are going to sit with this together, without the exits. Section 9. Screams of Silence, the episode that broke something. Season 10, Episode 3. Originally aired the 30th of October 2011. Written by Alex Sulkin. Directed by Dominic Bianchi. This is the most complicated episode in the show's history to discuss in terms of hidden messages, because it contains within it two competing messages that are not fully reconciled with each other. The episode's intentions and the episode's effects are not the same thing, and the gap between them tells you something important about how the show was operating at this point in its run. The surface plot. Quagmire's sister Brenda arrives with her boyfriend Jeff, who is physically abusive. Jeff is openly, cartoonishly violent. He hits Brenda in front of everyone. He breaks her finger. He threatens and intimidates constantly. Brenda, meanwhile, is in deep denial about the reality of her relationship. She covers for Jeff. She makes excuses. She believes things will get better. Peter, Joe, and Quagmire attempt to help her, first through an intervention, then, when that fails, by taking Jeff on a hunting trip where Quagmire kills him, and Joe fabricates a note from Jeff saying he has left Brenda voluntarily. The hidden message the episode intends to send is fairly clear. Domestic violence is serious, abusers do not change, and conventional systems of redress such as law enforcement, depicted here by Joe telling Quagmire he cannot arrest Jeff without Brenda filing a complaint, often fail victims in ways that have real consequences. This is not wrong as a set of observations. The episode is trying to do something sincere about a serious topic, and the sincerity is real. The hidden message the episode actually sends is more troubling. Brenda is portrayed throughout as almost entirely passive, as someone whose inability to recognize her own abuse makes her incomprehensible and therefore somewhat unsympathetic, despite the show's apparent desire to make her sympathetic. The solution that the episode arrives at, having three men decide to murder the abusive boyfriend on Brenda's behalf and then deceive her about what happened, replicates a paternalistic logic that is itself part of the problem with how domestic violence is often handled by people who are not its victims. Brenda is not given agency in her own story. She is not part of the decision to remove the threat. She is managed, like a problem to be solved, by the men in her life. The episode also generated real-world controversy from domestic violence advocacy organizations and critics who pointed out that its portrayal of how abuse victims behave, its depiction of the kind of naive, self-defeating denial that keeps people in harmful relationships as something like a character flaw rather than a recognized psychological response to sustained trauma, was both inaccurate and potentially harmful. The show was making a kind of abuse visible that it wanted to take seriously, but it was doing so through a framework that inadvertently reproduced some of the misconceptions it was trying to challenge. The fact that the episode aired the week before Screams of Silence, which aired on October 30th, and was followed the very next week by the episode Seahorse Seashell Party, in which Meg stands up to her abusive family and is ultimately convinced to return to her role as the family's designated punching bag, is a juxtaposition that the show did not seem to notice. In one episode, the message is that abusers deserve violence and victims deserve rescue. In the next episode, the message is that abuse victims should stay in their situation for the stability of the people hurting them. These two messages are directly contradictory, and the fact that they aired a week apart speaks to the inconsistency of the show's moral compass at this stage of its life. The Screams of Silence episode was controversial enough to generate a director's cut in 2014, which restructured significant portions of the original episode in response to the criticism it had received. This is extremely rare for an animated series. The fact that the show's own production team eventually felt the need to revisit and revise the episode suggests that the gap between the episode's intentions and its effects was real and recognized. What Screams of Silence reveals, when you look at it as part of the show's larger pattern rather than in isolation, is the danger of a show attempting to carry serious social messages without the structural support to handle them carefully. The early seasons of Family Guy had a coherent moral framework that gave their social commentary direction and clarity. By season 10, that framework had eroded significantly. The show still wanted to say things. It still had the impulse to use its platform for something beyond pure entertainment. But it no longer had the consistent internal logic that could guide those impulses into something genuinely useful. The episode wanted to be a PSA about domestic violence. It ended up being a case study in why hidden messages require more than good intentions. They require craft, consistency, and a willingness to follow the logic of your own premise all the way through, including the parts that are uncomfortable for the people behind the camera rather than just the people on the screen. Section 10. The Quagmire Paradox when the show criticized itself without meaning to. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most interesting hidden messages in Family Guy's entire run, and he is interesting precisely because the message he carries changed over time in ways that the show seems not to have fully intended. Quagmire was introduced as a cartoon exaggeration of a specific type of heterosexual male sexuality. He is hypersexual to the point of absurdity. He collects women the way Peter collects absurd hobbies. He has a specific, enthusiastic, performative relationship to his own desires that the show plays for laughs through his catchphrase and his expressions of gleeful anticipation. In the early seasons, the comedy around Quagmire was predicated on the understanding that his behavior was being exaggerated to the point of cartoon unreality. He was not a portrait of real sexual dynamics. He was a caricature of them, and the caricature created enough distance that the audience could laugh at the type without feeling like they were endorsing the behavior. As the show went on, this distance collapsed. The exaggeration remained, but the surrounding framework that established it as exaggeration, the other characters' clear disapproval, the occasional consequence, the awareness that the show knew this was not normal behavior, gradually disappeared. Quagmire became simply a character who did these things, and the show's relationship to those things shifted from satirical to celebratory. He was no longer a commentary on a certain kind of male behavior. He was a hero of it. The hidden message in this shift is uncomfortable, because it is a message about the show's own relationship to the culture it was supposedly satirizing. The early show used Quagmire to say something about the way a certain kind of male sexual entitlement operates in the world. The later show used Quagmire to endorse that entitlement, to present it as funny and charming and at worst harmlessly excessive. This is the difference between satire and normalization, and the show crossed that line somewhere around season 5 or 6 and never quite crossed back. What makes the Quagmire Paradox particularly interesting is the episode Jerome is the New Black, from season 8, in which Quagmire delivers his famous speech to Brian. In this speech, Quagmire catalogs Brian's hypocrisy, his pretensions to intellectual and moral superiority, his self-serving behavior dressed up in the language of principle. The speech is devastatingly accurate. Every point Quagmire makes is backed up by things the show has actually depicted Brian doing, and the show clearly intends for the audience to agree with Quagmire, to see his takedown of Brian as justified and incisive. But here is the thing. Quagmire's legitimate criticisms of Brian are delivered by a character who has done, across the show's run, things that are significantly worse than anything Brian is accused of in the speech. He has drugged women. He has been depicted as sexually coercive in ways that the show plays as jokes. He has used his attractiveness and his confidence to manipulate people repeatedly. The show presents him as Brian's moral superior in the moment of the speech, and it has never shown much awareness of the degree to which Quagmire's own behavior undermines his standing to deliver that kind of moral indictment. This is the hidden message underneath the speech. The show's moral compass, by season 8, had become so skewed that it could position one of its most consistently predatory characters as the voice of ethical clarity without noticing the contradiction. Quagmire calling Brian a phony is not wrong. Quagmire being the one to call Brian a phony is very funny. But the show's apparent comfort with this framing, its apparent belief that the audience would simply accept Quagmire as morally credible on these grounds, reveals something about what the show thought its audience valued and what it thought was funny versus what it thought was wrong. There are episodes scattered throughout the show's later seasons in which Quagmire's behavior is addressed directly and the show attempts to have him reckon with it. These moments are usually short and always immediately reversed. He does something that would, in any realistic context, be actionable. The show acknowledges it, vaguely. The next episode, it is forgotten. This cycle is itself a hidden message, one that the show did not intend to send. That certain kinds of male behavior are so embedded in the culture's comfort that even a show nominally committed to satire finds it easier to cycle through temporary acknowledgement and permanent forgetting than to actually confront them. Section 11. Seahorse Seashell Party, the most damning hidden message of them all. Season 10, Episode 2. Written by Wellesley Wild. Originally aired the 2nd of October 2011. We have talked about the treatment of Meg Griffin as a running thread in the show's history. But Seahorse Seashell Party deserves its own extended discussion because it is the episode in which the show most explicitly acknowledged what it had been doing to Meg and then most clearly decided to keep doing it anyway. And the justification it offered, the reasoning it gave, is the hidden message that the episode sends whether it meant to or not. The setup of the episode is a hurricane trapping the Griffin family in their house. Brian, bored, eats psychedelic mushrooms and has a vivid drug experience that runs as the episode's B-plot. The A-plot concerns Meg finally reaching a breaking point. After years and years and seasons of relentless abuse from her family, she snaps. She confronts each of them. She delivers speeches to Chris, to Lois, and to Peter that are honest, specific, and accurate. She names the things they have done. She names how those things have affected her. She tells them what she thinks of them. These speeches are among the most carefully written moments Meg ever receives in the show's entire run. Mila Kunis delivers them with real force and real pain. The show is, for a moment, doing exactly what it had the capacity to do, and so rarely chose to. Taking Meg's experience seriously, giving her language for it, letting her speak her truth. And then the family falls apart. Without Meg to serve as the designated target, Peter turns on Lois. Lois turns on Chris. The family's dysfunction, which had always been channeled through the abuse of Meg, suddenly has nowhere to go and floods through all of them. The family structure, such as it is, collapses. Brian then explains to Meg what has happened. He tells her that she functions as a lightning rod for the family's dysfunction, that she absorbs their collective frustration and self-loathing and projects it outward as hostility toward her, and that in doing so she prevents it from tearing the family apart. He suggests, and the show frames this as wisdom rather than cruelty, that this is Meg's purpose, that she should understand this and embrace it, or at least accept it. Meg goes back to the family. She takes back what she said. She resumes her role. The episode frames this as a kind of bittersweet growth on Meg's part, as her coming to understand something true about the mechanics of her family and choosing, from a position of understanding, to continue playing her role in it. The word the episode reaches for is something like maturity or self-awareness. She knows now. Knowing makes her choice meaningful in a way it was not before. This is the hidden message, and it is genuinely troubling. The show is telling its audience that abuse victims who understand the function their abuse serves in a larger system are somehow more at peace with their situation than those who do not. That enlightenment, in this context, means accepting victimhood rather than refusing it. That the correct response to understanding why you are being hurt is to decide to keep being hurt because the alternative is too disruptive to the people who are hurting you. This is not a message that the show intended to send in a harmful way. The writers appear to have believed, genuinely, that this ending was poignant rather than disturbing. They appear to have thought they were giving Meg a kind of dignity in her suffering. But what they actually produced was a philosophical argument for why abuse victims should stay in abusive situations, dressed up in the language of insight and acceptance and love. The critical response to the episode, when it aired, was not uniformly negative in the way the Screams of Silence response was. Some critics praised the Meg storyline as the show's most honest reckoning with what it had done to the character. Others were furious about the ending. The divide was essentially between people who read the ending as Meg choosing her family with full awareness, which the show intended, and people who read it as the show telling Meg that she deserves what she gets, which the show did not intend but produced anyway. The episode was dedicated to the memory of Seth MacFarlane's mother, Anne Perry MacFarlane, who had died of breast cancer. This personal context makes the episode even more interesting to sit with. It was a piece of television in which the show's creator was processing grief, and the vehicle for that processing was an episode about a young woman who decides to stay in a painful situation out of love for the family that has been hurting her. The connection between those two things, the grief and the theme, is worth holding. There are no clean answers here. The episode is doing several things at once. It is a genuine attempt to give Meg depth and agency, and a form of love that is painful but real. It is also, inescapably, an episode that ends with a young woman returning to her abusers, and the show framing this as the right choice. Both things are true simultaneously, and the dissonance between them is the truest hidden message the episode sends. That the show, even when it genuinely tried to do right by Meg, could not fully escape the pattern it had created. Section 12. The political episodes: What the show was saying about America. Family Guy's relationship with American political life across its 20-plus seasons is a subject that would fill a book, and we are not going to try to compress it into a short section. But there are threads worth pulling here, because the show's political commentary at its best was doing something more interesting than simple partisan cheerleading, and understanding what it was doing illuminates the kind of show it was trying to be. The show's early seasons treated politics the way they treated everything, as material. The jokes about the Clintons, the Bushes, the various political figures who cycled through in cutaways and gags were barbs rather than arguments. They were pointed, they were funny, and they moved on. The show was not trying to change your mind. It was trying to make you laugh at something true. As the show moved through the 2000s, this changed. The Iraq War produced a generation of animated political comedy that was sharper and more urgent than the variety that preceded it. South Park became more politically aggressive. The Daily Show was becoming essential viewing. And Family Guy, in its own way, began moving from jokes about politics to episodes that made political arguments. The 420 episode in Season 7, in which Brian leads a campaign to legalize marijuana in the town, is a good example of this shift. The episode is a direct and fairly sustained argument for marijuana decriminalization. Brian's campaign, the tactics used to suppress it, the eventual victory, followed by the reversal of that victory due to corporate pressure from cotton and lumber industries, follows the logic of actual advocacy and actual opposition with more fidelity to political reality than the show usually managed in its later seasons. The episode generated real-world controversy. The Venezuelan government cited it as evidence of American drug promotion and banned the show from Venezuelan cable networks, warning that stations that continued airing it would be fined. Whatever you think about marijuana policy, the idea that an episode of Family Guy had enough real-world impact to generate a formal governmental response in another country says something about how far the show was willing to push its arguments and how seriously some of those arguments were taken. The show's treatment of patriotism and American militarism across its run is also worth noting, because it is more complicated than it first appears. Peter Griffin is a character who can be easily read as an avatar of a certain kind of American exceptionalism, the flag-waving, unreflective kind that the show mocks through him regularly. But the show's actual relationship with that mode of patriotism is more nuanced. It does not simply mock it, it is also fond of it. The show has genuine affection for the working-class American culture it depicts, and that affection exists in tension with its criticism. This tension, the love and critique that the show has for the world it was born out of, is one of the things that kept it from being simple propaganda in either direction. The episode It's a Trap, a parody of Return of the Jedi, quietly makes an argument about the costs of war by having the Rebel Alliance, avatared by the Griffin family, behave in ways that are recognizably corrupt and self-serving under the cover of their stated idealism. The jokes are about the movies. The structure underneath the jokes is about how organizations that define themselves by opposition to evil tend to reproduce that evil internally once they gain power. This is a theme that runs through much of the show's political commentary, that the problem is not specific villains but systemic patterns that outlast any individual. The show's episodes set in Washington, its various plotlines involving politicians and legislation, and the machinery of American governance, consistently depict that machinery as captured by commercial interests rather than responsive to democratic ones. This is a consistent political argument across many episodes, that the formal structures of American democracy function as theater while the real decisions are made by people with money. It is an argument that was somewhat cynical in the late 1990s when the show started, and had become, by the 2010s, a mainstream observation rather than a subversive one. But the show was making it early, and it was making it through comedy, which meant it reached audiences that more direct political commentary would not have. Seth MacFarlane's own politics are openly liberal, openly atheist, and have been public throughout the show's run. But the show has generally tried to distribute its satirical attention across the political spectrum rather than simply mocking one side. Peter is not a conservative caricature even when he exhibits conservative tendencies. He is a specific kind of American person, and that person is complex enough that the show can criticize him and love him simultaneously. The episodes that work least well politically are the ones where the balance tips entirely, where Brian becomes simply a mouthpiece for liberal opinion without the comedy or the self-awareness that would give the argument life. But even those episodes are doing something. They are putting positions on television that the network's typical programming might not have accommodated in a more direct form, wrapped in a format that allowed them to reach an audience that would not have sought them out otherwise. Section 13. The Stewie Arc, a long-form hidden message across 20 seasons. If you take a step back and look at the arc of Stewie Griffin's character across the entire run of Family Guy, what you see is not a series of isolated creative decisions. You see a sustained, long-form hidden message about identity, performance, and the gap between who a person chooses to present themselves as and who they actually are. In Season 1, Stewie is an evil genius. This is his identity. This is who he is, or at least who he has decided to be. He has built an entire elaborate self around the project of world domination and the elimination of his mother. The weapons, the schemes, the British accent, the theatrical villainy, all of these are a coherent self that Stewie has constructed and occupies with total confidence. But from very early in the series, the show introduces cracks. Small moments where Stewie is not quite the villain he has decided to be, where he shows vulnerability, affection, embarrassment, where the performance slips and something less certain appears underneath. These moments are initially played as jokes, as the comedy of incongruity between the character's stated identity and his revealed interior. But they accumulate over seasons into something that reads less like incongruity and more like a portrait of someone who has built a very elaborate self in response to not knowing who they are, and who is gradually, reluctantly, being forced to engage with that uncertainty. By the later seasons of the show, Stewie has almost entirely abandoned the evil genius identity. The world domination plots are gone. The attempts on Lois's life have faded to occasional callbacks rather than running threads. What remains is a character who is emotionally complex, socially uncertain, and deeply invested in his friendship with Brian as a source of meaning and stability. He has stories about identity and belonging and fear. He has episodes about anxiety and about the performance of confidence that masks something more frightened underneath. This is the hidden message the Stewie arc sends over its entire duration, that the personas we construct for ourselves, especially the grandiose ones, the ones built on power and control, and the certainty that we know what we want and how to get it, are often defensive structures rather than genuine expressions of who we are. That underneath the ambition and the menace there is usually something softer and more frightened that could not be acknowledged directly, so it was buried under elaborate architecture. Whether the writers intended this reading of Stewie's arc is debatable. The stated reason for the shift was that the creative team felt the evil genius premise had been exhausted and wanted to take the character somewhere new. But the direction they chose, and the emotional logic that runs through the later Stewie episodes, creates a coherent arc that carries this message, whether or not it was consciously planned. The arc also says something about the show itself. Family Guy, in its early seasons, was a show that presented itself as unapologetically edgy and transgressive. Its evil genius baby was a symbol of that self-presentation, confident, aggressive, certain of its own superiority. As the show aged, it became less confident, more uncertain, more interested in emotional reality and less interested in the posture of transgression for its own sake. The best episodes of the later seasons are the ones, like Brian and Stewie, where that uncertainty is allowed to surface and engage with something real. Stewie's arc, whatever its origins, mirrors the show's own journey from performance to something more honest. Section 14. The Meg Years and the Unintended Message That Haunts the Show. There is a reading of Family Guy's treatment of Meg Griffin across the full run of the show that is darker than any individual episode of it. This reading goes like this. The show, without ever quite acknowledging it, spent roughly 10 seasons sending a message to its audience about what happens to girls and young women who want things. Meg wants to be loved. Meg wants to be accepted. Meg wants her family to be proud of her, her peers to like her, the world to see her as a person worth acknowledging. These are fundamental human desires. And the show punished her for having them, consistently, across hundreds of episodes, in ways that escalated from mild to genuinely disturbing. The writers of early Family Guy have said in interviews and DVD commentaries that the joke with Meg was always supposed to be about her ordinariness relative to her extraordinary family. In a household with an evil genius baby, and a talking dog, and a father who regularly encounters God and death, and a mother who has had multiple secret lives, the normal teenage girl is the anomaly. She is the one who does not fit. The comedy was meant to be about that displacement. This reading of Meg's early characterization is real. In seasons 1 through 3, the joke is gentle and it is about context. Meg is boring by comparison to her family, which is itself the most bizarre family on television. Her attempts to be cool, her crushes, her social struggles at school, are played with something like warmth. The show likes her in those seasons. It does not particularly like being her, but it is fond of her. The hidden message in what happened to Meg after the show returned in 2005 is about what happens when comedy machinery that was built for a specific, limited purpose gets fed more material than it was designed to process. The joke was never meant to be about hating Meg. It was meant to be about Meg's ordinariness. But ordinariness is a thin premise, and the writers who came in after the cancellations and revival needed something to do with the character. She was not central enough to carry stories. She was not distinctive enough to be a comic engine, but Schwalgo present. And when you have a character who is present but not doing anything, the easiest thing to do with them is to make them the target. The escalation from there follows a horrible internal logic. The audience responds to Meg being abused. The writers go back to that response. They escalate. They get another response. They escalate further. The abuse becomes normalized within the world of the show. It becomes a running characteristic of the family rather than an exception. And the writers, who are producing 20-odd episodes a season on a relentless schedule, do not step back and ask what the cumulative effect of all of this is. They just keep going. The hidden message that results is not one any individual writer sat down and decided to send. It is the emergent message of a system that was optimized for immediate response, without accountability for cumulative effect. And that message, when you read the full 10 seasons of Meg's worst treatment and sequence, is something that no one at Family Guy would have endorsed if it had been stated plainly. That some people, specifically girls who want things and do not conform to the standards their community has set for them, deserve what they get. The show has been in a long, slow process of walking this back since around season 14. More women on the writing staff brought more awareness of what the accumulated Meg storylines were communicating. Episodes have been produced in which Meg is competent and capable and tough, and the target of something more like affectionate frustration than genuine contempt. The most recent seasons have been far kinder to her than those middle years. But the years are part of the record. The unintended message is part of what the show sent. And the fact that it was unintended does not make it less real as a piece of communication that went out to an enormous audience across a significant period of time. Section 15. Back to the pilot and what the show knows about itself. Season 10, Episode 5. Back to the pilot. In this episode, Brian and Stewie use the time machine to travel back to the first episode of the show. They interact with their past selves. They observe the 1,999 versions of the Griffin family. The episode is ostensibly a comedy about time travel and the paradoxes it creates. There is a timeline-destroying subplot involving 9/11 that is tonally strange and does not fully work. But the reason the episode is worth discussing in this context is what it reveals about the show's self-awareness at this point in its run. When Brian and Stewie observe the 1,999 versions of the characters, the present-day Brian is struck by how different the show was. The animation is different, the characters behave differently, the rhythm of the comedy is different. The show depicts its own first episode with a kind of nostalgic wonder, as if looking at photographs of a younger, more vital self. The hidden message here is the show acknowledging, through the fiction of time travel, that it is aware of its own decline. The present-day Stewie and Brian, representing the show as it currently exists, look at the past versions of themselves and see something they have lost. They do not quite know how they lost it. The episode does not offer an analysis or a plan to recover it. It just holds up the mirror and lets the audience see the reflection. This kind of self-awareness, the show making jokes about its own diminished quality, became increasingly common in the later seasons. Characters would reference the fact that the show had been on too long. Peter would break the fourth wall to comment on the declining ratings. The writers would use the show's meta-awareness as a substitute for actually doing something about the underlying problems. This is, in a way, the final hidden message. The show knows. It knows what it was. It knows what it became. It knows the gap between those two things is real and visible and significant. And it knows that continuing to run, continuing to produce new episodes, continuing to inhabit the brand and the characters and the format while the fire inside it has burned lower is a choice that it is making for reasons that have more to do with commerce than with art. The self-awareness is real. The willingness to act on that self-awareness, to actually change, to actually recover something of what had been lost, was always more limited than the awareness itself. The show could see itself clearly from a certain angle. It just kept choosing the other angle most of the time. The episode Back to the Pilot ends with the timeline somewhat repaired, the past somewhat intact, the present restored to something like its normal condition. The Stewie and Brian of Season 10 return to their world. The Stewie and Brian of Season 1 continue in theirs. The two timelines do not quite touch again. This is, if you want it to be, a metaphor. The show that Family Guy was in 1999 continues to exist in those 3 seasons, fully intact, running on Adult Swim at 3 a.m. and on DVD collections in people's rooms. The show that Family Guy became after the revival continues alongside it, in a different timeline, making different choices, sending different messages. They are both real. They are both the same show. And the gap between them is the most honest thing the series ever communicated about itself. Section 16. Road to Rhode Island, and the grief that lives in Brian. Before the vault. Before the gun in the safety deposit box. Before all of the later seasons' explorations of Brian's interior life, there was an episode in Season 2 that established the foundation of everything complicated and everything real about who Brian Griffin was and where he came from. Road to Rhode Island aired on the 30th of May 2000. It was the 13th episode of the second season, written by Gary Janetti, and it is remembered today primarily as the first episode in the Road to series, the recurring format of Brian and Stewie adventure episodes that became some of the most beloved content the show ever produced. The chemistry between those two characters, the way their completely opposed sensibilities created a kind of comedic music when placed in close proximity and forced to cooperate, was established here and never stopped generating something worthwhile across the years that followed. But Road to Rhode Island is not really about the road trip. The road trip is the container. What the episode is about, what its hidden message is, sits in a brief sequence near the middle of the episode that many viewers have described as one of the most unexpectedly emotional moments in the show's entire run. Brian and Stewie, making their way back to Rhode Island by whatever means are available, end up in Austin, Texas. Brian has been seeing a psychiatrist, as established at the episode's opening in a scene that already tells you something about the show's understanding of its own character. A talking dog who drinks martinis and reads Dostoevsky and cannot finish his novel is also someone who goes to therapy. The show is not mining this for irony. It accepts it as a simple truth about Brian. He is someone who carries things that require professional help to process. He goes, he talks about them. What he talks about in the opening session is his mother, the circumstances under which he was taken from her as a puppy. He was born in a puppy mill, which is one of the most emotionally loaded settings the show could have chosen for this backstory. A puppy mill is not simply a place where dogs are bred. It is a specific form of industrial exploitation, a place where the welfare of the animals involved is secondary or irrelevant to their commercial utility. Brian was born into a system that treated his birth as a transaction and his mother as a production resource. And then he was taken from her. The image the show uses for this moment is simple and quiet and devastating in its brevity. A puppy being lifted from his mother, who watches him go without being able to follow. The show does not dwell on this. It does not score it heavily or frame it for maximum pathos. It happens and then the episode moves on. But the resonance of it travels through the rest of the episode in ways that the surface comedy cannot fully cover. In Austin, Brian finds a farm where his mother was sold after the puppy mill closed. He goes to see her. He finds her. She has been living as a farm dog for years, and she does not recognize him. She cannot. She is just a dog in the way that Brian, for all his eloquence and his reading and his martini glass, is also just a dog when the world is being honest about what he is. She plays with him briefly. She licks his face. She cannot speak to him. She cannot remember him. And Brian, who has built an entire intellectual life around the premise that he is not quite like other dogs, has to stand in a Texas farmyard and face the fact that the mother he has been carrying with him in his memories, the mother he goes to therapy to process his feelings about, is an animal who does not know him and cannot love him the way he has needed her to. She dies shortly after. The show handles this death quickly, almost matter-of-factly. Brian sits with her for a moment. He sings her a small song. He buries her. This is the hidden message that the episode carries, that the distance between who we believe ourselves to be and what our origins actually were is one of the fundamental sources of human pain. Brian Griffin has constructed an identity around intelligence and cultivation, and belonging to the human world rather than the animal one. And this episode shows him, quietly, alone in a field, confronted with the actual circumstances of his birth. The puppy mill, the abandonment, the mother who was never able to be a mother in any meaningful sense because the system she existed in did not allow for it. This is grief, real, specific, not cartoonish grief about origins and mothers and the impossibility of going back to a beginning that was already broken when you were in it. The show holds this grief for the duration of one scene. It does not try to resolve it or domesticate it or turn it into a lesson. It just lets Brian be in it for a moment, and then the episode continues. Stewie, who has been present for all of this, says almost nothing. He does not know what to say. He cannot fix it. He covers for Brian when they get home, and Lois asks why they are late. He does not make fun of what he witnessed. He simply lets Brian have the experience he had and keeps quiet about the details. This moment between Stewie and Brian, the care in Stewie's silence, is the first real instance of the friendship that would eventually become the emotional center of the show. It is built on the foundation of Stewie having seen something true about Brian and choosing to protect it rather than use it. That choice, small and unremarked upon, is the beginning of everything the show would later try to do with these two characters. The episode was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. It lost to a Simpsons episode, but the nomination acknowledged something real, that the episode had done something that animated television rarely managed, which was to make a moment of genuine emotional sorrow land inside a comedy without either breaking the comedy or cheapening the sorrow. Both things coexisted. The funny episode about a road trip was also an episode about a son who lost his mother before he ever really had her, and the show held both without apology. Section 17. Holy crap, I am Peter. Hear me roar. And the episodes about what masculinity costs? Family Guy has spent its entire run living inside the question of what it means to be a man in the specific cultural moment the show inhabits. Peter Griffin is not simply a comedy character. He is a portrait of a particular kind of American masculinity, and the show's relationship with that portrait has shifted dramatically across its seasons in ways that reveal something important about how the culture's conversation around these questions has changed. In the early seasons, Peter is recognizably a man of a specific generation and class formation. He is working class, limited education, raised by a father whose emotional vocabulary was narrow and whose affection was expressed through presence rather than language. He drinks with his friends. He watches a lot of television. He makes impulsive decisions based on immediate desire rather than careful consideration. He is not reflective. He is not particularly curious about himself. He operates on the assumption that the things he was taught to value, family, loyalty, humor, basic decency in his own terms, are sufficient for a life, and he does not spend much time questioning whether that assumption is correct. What the early show does with this portrait is affectionate and also clear-eyed. It sees Peter as genuinely lovable and also genuinely limited. It laughs at his limitations, but it does not hate him for them. The comedy comes from the gap between Peter's confidence in his own adequacy and the actual complexity of the situations he encounters, a gap that produces chaos but not malice. Peter bumbles, he misunderstands. He occasionally hurts people by accident, and then tries clumsily to fix what he has broken. The cycle of mistake, regret, and repair is the moral structure of the early episodes. Season 1's episode I Am Peter, Hear Me Roar sends Peter to a gender sensitivity seminar after he tells a joke at work that offends a female colleague. The episode is playing with the specific cultural anxiety of the late 1990s around political correctness, around what workplace culture was demanding of men who had grown up in environments with very different norms. Peter's discomfort at being told his humor is harmful is played for laughs, but the episode also tracks Peter through a genuine shift. He comes back from the seminar having actually absorbed something, having taken on the concerns of the women around him with real, if temporary, enthusiasm. The comedy in this phase comes from Peter's overcorrection, from his adoption of feminist language and frameworks in ways that are absurdly literal and that create different problems than the ones he started with. What the episode is actually doing is something more careful than it first appears. It is not mocking feminism. It is mocking the specific way that ideas travel when they pass through a person who has not fully integrated them, who is wearing them rather than being changed by them. Peter in feminist mode is still Peter. He has added vocabulary without adding understanding. And the episode lets this run until the comedy of it has made its point, that the thing the seminar was trying to produce, genuine empathy and consideration for the experiences of the women around him, is not something that can be installed in a 3-day workshop. It requires something slower and harder than that. The hidden message in episodes like this, across the show's first few seasons, is that masculinity as culturally transmitted to men like Peter is not simply a social construction that can be easily revised. It is a deep formation. It is structural. The things Peter does not know how to do, how to articulate his feelings, how to consider the emotional impact of his behavior on others before he acts, how to exist in relationships with women as something other than a clumsy protagonist who needs to be forgiven, are not failures of character. They are the consequences of a specific kind of upbringing in a specific kind of culture, and undoing them requires more than a single conversation. The show's later seasons abandoned this nuanced portrait and replaced it with something cruder. A Peter who is not limited but actively malicious, not the product of his formation, but a monster who operates without the basic empathy that the early Peter, for all his failures, possessed. This shift, from a portrait of a man limited by his formation to a portrait of a man limited by his nature, is one of the most significant ways the show's hidden message about masculinity changed over time. The early episodes argued that these problems were systemic and potentially changeable. The later episodes argued that some men are simply bad and will remain so. These are very different arguments, and the show moved from one to the other without ever fully acknowledging the shift. The episode Holy Crap, from Season 1, introduces Peter's father Francis and uses the father-son relationship to say something about how masculinity reproduces itself generationally. Francis is everything Peter is, but more so, more rigid, more certain, more willing to use his authority to demand conformity. Peter chafes against him. Peter is also, unmistakably, his son. The traits he is pushing against in Francis are traits he carries himself, expressed somewhat differently but rooted in the same formation. The comedy of their interactions is the comedy of a person arguing with their own reflection, failing to fully see the similarity because the similarity is uncomfortable to see. This is the hidden message across the father-son arc that runs through the show's early seasons, that the things we resent most in our parents are often the things we have inherited from them. That the process of becoming an adult involves, for many people, a gradual and painful recognition of how much of your parents you have become despite your best intentions, and that this recognition is not a tragedy. It is just the way formation works. You are made by the people who raised you. You spend your life deciding what to do with what you were made. The episodes that explored this territory in the early seasons were doing so with a warmth that made the recognition bearable. The later seasons, which mostly abandoned this territory in favor of louder, more chaotic versions of Peter's dysfunction, lost something real in giving it up. Section 18. The sleepover episodes, the Christmas episodes, and what the show said about loneliness. There is a category of Family Guy episode that does not often get discussed in analyses of the show's hidden messages, and that is the category of episodes built around the holidays and around the particular loneliness that certain kinds of people feel when the culture is insisting they should be feeling something else entirely. The show's Christmas episodes form a recurring thread across its run, and taken together they constitute a quiet and surprisingly consistent hidden message about the gap between what Christmas is supposed to feel like and what it actually feels like for many of the people watching the show. Road to the North Pole, the two-part Season 9 Christmas episode, is on the surface an adventure story about Stewie and Brian traveling to the North Pole to confront Santa Claus. But what they find when they get there is remarkable in the context of a primetime animated Christmas special. Santa is not jolly. He is exhausted. He is depleted. The global consumer demand for Christmas gifts has grown so enormous that he and Mrs. Claus and their limited staff of elves are working themselves toward collapse trying to meet it. The reindeer are maimed. The operation is falling apart. Santa, when Stewie and Brian find him, is a broken man. The hidden message here is about consumption, about the specific form of holiday exhaustion that has become one of the defining experiences of modern Christmas in consumer societies. The episode is a satire of Christmas capitalism, delivered in the format of a family-friendly holiday adventure, and the dissonance between those two things is precisely what makes it work. Children watching get the adventure, adults watching get the critique. Both audiences watch the same episode and receive completely different things from it, which is the ideal form of hidden message delivery. The episode also touches something more personal. The picture of Santa as someone who has committed himself to an impossible standard of generosity and is being destroyed by the gap between what he promised and what he can deliver resonates with anyone who has felt that gap in their own life. Parents who cannot afford the gifts their children want. Adults who have built their sense of worthiness around their ability to provide and are running out of capacity to sustain that self-concept. People who associate the holidays with obligation and dread more than with warmth and celebration. The show sees these people. It does not name them directly, but it builds its Christmas episodes around the emotional reality of their experience, wrapping that reality in enough comedy and adventure that the emotional content can enter the audience without being identified and resisted. The episode Christmas has been aired in Season 15, and it takes a different approach to the same territory. In it, various members of the Griffin family and their neighbors have Christmas experiences that go wrong in recognizable ways. Gifts that miss the mark, family dynamics that the holiday fails to suspend, the sheer exhaustion of maintaining the performance of celebration over the course of the day. The episode is structured as multiple shorter storylines rather than one continuous narrative, which gives it a kind of anthology quality, a collection of vignettes about the specific ways Christmas fails people, rather than a single master narrative about what the holiday means. What unifies these stories is the sense that the Griffins and the people around them are all, in their different ways, trying to be something for Christmas that they are not quite capable of being. Peter is trying to be a good father. Lois is trying to be the family's emotional center. Quagmire is trying to find connection. Joe is trying to pretend that his marriage is better than it is. The holiday is functioning as a kind of stress test, as it does for many families, revealing the gaps between who people are and who they are trying to be rather than papering them over. The hidden message across all of these holiday episodes is the same one that the best holiday storytelling has always contained. That the holidays are not a time when everything becomes simpler and more pure. They are a time when everything becomes more concentrated and more visible. The love is more visible. The loneliness is more visible. The disappointment is more visible. The gap between what you have and what you wanted is right there in the room with you, decorated with lights and smelling like pine needles, refusing to be ignored. Family Guy's Christmas episodes see this with something approaching compassion. They make it funny, which is itself an act of compassion toward the people who recognize themselves in it. If you can laugh at the gap between what Christmas is supposed to be and what it actually is, the gap becomes slightly more bearable. Not smaller, not closed, just slightly less suffocating. There is also a recurring presence of loneliness as a theme in the show's quieter episodes that deserves acknowledgement. The B-plots and minor storylines that run alongside the main action often feature characters in states of isolation that the show does not dramatize but simply depicts. Cleveland going home to an empty apartment after his divorce. Joe struggling with the distance that his injury and his grief have created between himself and the people he loves. Quagmire, under all the sexual comedy, living alone in a house that is designed around the accommodation of temporary company rather than any sustained human presence. The show has always been populated by lonely people who manage their loneliness through performance. Peter through bluster, Brian through intellectual posturing, Quagmire through the relentless pursuit of distraction. The comedy runs on top of this loneliness, but the loneliness is there, underneath, visible, if you are looking for it. And in the quiet hours, when the show is running in the background and your attention is soft and open rather than analytical and defended, it is often the loneliness that registers most clearly. Not as a sad thing to fix, but as a true thing to recognize. As a reminder that the people on the screen, cartoon characters in a ridiculous Rhode Island town, are carrying something that has a real weight to it, and that the show at its best knew that and made space for it. Section 19. The show's relationship with class and what it always understood about money. We have been moving through specific episodes and specific hidden messages, but there is one hidden message that runs so continuously through the show's DNA that it almost ceases to be hidden. It is simply the texture of the world the show inhabits. It is in the houses and the jobs and the things the characters cannot afford, and the things they spend money on anyway because the spending is one of the few forms of pleasure available to people in their situation. Family Guy is a show about economic anxiety, not in a didactic or explicit way, not in the way that a documentary or a political drama would be, but in the way that a show made by people who understand that kind of anxiety and made for people who share it always is. It is present in the details, in the small choices that the characters make and cannot make, in the specific form that their dreams take, and the specific ways those dreams fail. Peter Griffin works at a brewery. Before that, he worked at a toy factory. These are working-class jobs in the sense that matters economically. They are jobs that provide a living wage for a family of 5 in a Rhode Island town, but they do not provide security. They do not provide the kind of financial cushion that makes a crisis manageable rather than catastrophic. Peter and Lois are people who are always, at some level, one bad month away from a problem. The show has never been interested in making this explicit. It does not do episodes about economic precarity in the way that a drama might, but it allows the economic reality of the Griffins' lives to shape the kinds of stories it tells. Peter's schemes, across the show's run, are almost always about getting something he cannot normally afford: recognition, status, money, access to things that other people seem to have without effort. The schemes fail. They always fail. And the failure is often because Peter did not have the resources, economic or social or intellectual, that successful execution would have required. This is not presented as a moral failing. The show is clear, in its early seasons especially, that Peter's situation is the product of a world that distributed opportunity unevenly, and that the absence of opportunity is not the same thing as the absence of virtue. Peter is not a bad man who deserves his struggles. He is an ordinary man in an ordinary economic situation that the mainstream cultural narrative of his era, the late 1990s prosperity story, wanted to pretend was no longer the dominant reality for millions of Americans. The town of Steubenville that Cleveland Brown moved to in the Cleveland Show, the city that the Griffins inhabit as their social world, is populated almost entirely by people in this situation. Joe Swanson is a police officer, which is a government job with reasonable stability but also with the specific physical and psychological costs of that work. Cleveland is a shipping clerk. Quagmire is an airline pilot, which is somewhat more economically elevated than the others, and the show has always placed him very slightly outside the core group's solidarity because of it, making him less relatable and more of a projection of aspirational lifestyle. The specific economic anxieties that the show processes through its comedy have shifted with the times. The late 1990s episodes are about the anxiety of a working-class family in an economy that was booming but distributing the boom elsewhere. The mid-2000s episodes absorb the post-2001 anxiety of a country that felt suddenly more dangerous and less certain. The 2008 and 2009 seasons coincide almost exactly with the financial crisis. And while the show does not address the crisis directly in most of its episodes, there is a quality of exhaustion and desperation in certain storylines from that period that reflects the ambient economic reality. The hidden message in all of this is simply, we see you. We see the people for whom the economy has always been a source of precarity rather than opportunity. We are making comedy in and about and for that world, and the comedy does not require the precarity to be fixed or explained or resolved. The Griffins will still be behind on something next episode. Peter will still be making bad decisions driven by short-term thinking and limited options. The comedy will continue. The situation will not be solved. Because the situation is not a plot problem to be solved. It is the texture of the lives of people who have always lived in it, and the show's hidden message about money is simply that it understands this and does not require you to be ashamed of it. Section 20. The ASMR quality of Family Guy, and why familiar voices in the dark do something specific. We have been doing something unusual tonight, and it is worth naming it before we close. We have been approaching a show that was designed to be actively watched, to be laughed at in a social context, or at minimum with your full attention engaged, as if it were something else entirely. We have been using it as an ambient environment, as background sound, as something that runs alongside consciousness rather than demanding it. This is not as strange as it might sound. There is a long history of people using familiar television as sleep and relaxation aid, and animated comedy has always been particularly effective in this role because of the specific qualities of its production. The voice acting in animated shows is inherently more consistent and more controlled than live-action performance. The same voice comes from the same body at the same microphone distance in recording session after recording session. There are no unexpected inflections from actors who had a difficult day. No sudden volume shifts from a scene where a performer had to physically exert themselves. The sound is designed and even and safe in a way that the unpredictable sounds of live performance are not. Seth MacFarlane's voice, which carries all four of the show's major male characters, has a specific quality to it that becomes, over time, deeply familiar. The bass resonance of Peter, the clipped precision of Brian, the rounded, theatrical vowels of Stewie, the honeyed, slightly predatory drawl of Quagmire. These are four distinct instruments playing out of the same body, and after enough exposure to them, they create something like a sound environment rather than a set of distinct characters. They become the sound of the show rather than the sound of four people, and that ambient quality makes them effective as a kind of vocal wallpaper that is interesting enough to register but comfortable enough not to demand. Alex Borstein's Lois, with its specific New England cadence and its particular warmth even in moments of exasperation, fills a different register. Mila Kunis's Meg adds a younger, slightly more vulnerable texture. Seth Green's Chris contributes an earnestness that is funny precisely because it is so guileless. Together, across a given episode, these voices weave a specific sonic environment that the brain, after enough familiarity, associates with something like safety. This is the ASMR quality of Family Guy, and it is something the show produces not by design but as a byproduct of its production qualities. The consistency of the animation's sound design, the reliability of the voice cast across 25 years, the familiarity of the music and the transitions and the rhythms of the cutaway format, all of these things together create a sensory environment that the brain has learned to recognize as non-threatening, not stimulating, not alarming, just there, continuing, predictable in its unpredictability. And in this state, as we have been discussing tonight, the hidden messages move differently. They are not processed through analysis. They settle. The argument about free speech in PTV becomes a feeling about the right to say things without being silenced. The grief in Road to Rhode Island becomes a feeling about mothers and loss that does not require you to locate it in Brian's specific story. The claustrophobia of the vault in Brian and Stewie becomes a feeling about honesty and the places we store the truths we cannot bring ourselves to say in ordinary circumstances. The messages do their work in the dark, quietly, without demanding that you acknowledge them, which is, when you think about it, exactly how the best hidden messages always operate. They do not announce themselves. They arrive sideways. They find their way in through the door you left open when you were paying attention to something else. Family Guy has been leaving messages like this for 25 years. Some of them were clear and intentional and aimed directly at specific targets. Some of them were accidents that revealed something the show did not quite mean to reveal. Some of them were the show thinking out loud about things that mattered to the people making it. Some of them were the ambient residue of the culture, absorbed into the show and redistributed without much deliberate thought. All of them are still there, running underneath the jokes, running alongside the cutaways, running through the familiar voices in the dark. You do not have to work to receive them. You just have to be quiet enough for them to find you. And you are. Section 21. The episodes that never resolved, and why that was the point. There is one final category of hidden message worth addressing before we arrive at the closing. These are the episodes that ended without resolution. The ones where the problem was named, the situation was examined, the characters came close to something like change or growth or genuine reckoning, and then the credits rolled, and the next episode began as if the previous one had never happened. This is usually discussed as one of Family Guy's creative failures. The reset button, the refusal to let consequences stick, the way no event in the show's world ever permanently changes the shape of the world. And that criticism is fair. It is a structural limitation that has cost the show real emotional power across its run. But there is another way to read these unresolved endings, one that feels more accurate to the experience of watching the show across many years. The episodes that do not resolve are not simply failures of creative ambition. They are, in aggregate, a hidden message about the nature of the problems they are depicting, about what it actually means to live inside a situation that does not get fixed. Peter's cruelty toward Meg is not resolved across 25 seasons, because for the millions of people watching who grew up in families where certain dynamics simply never resolved, where certain wounds never healed, where certain patterns simply repeated regardless of the occasional moment of clarity or reconciliation, the reset button is not a creative failure. It is a documentary truth. The show does not resolve Peter's relationship with Meg because relationships like that, in the real world, rarely resolve. They cycle. They have moments of grace. They return to their default. They cycle again. This is the darkest and most quietly honest hidden message Family Guy ever sent. Not the political ones, not the censorship ones, not the grief ones. This one, that some things do not get better. That the machinery of certain kinds of family dysfunction runs on something deeper than any single moment of insight can reach. That you can have the conversation, you can make the speech, you can stand in the hurricane and say the true thing to the people who have been hurting you. And next week, the same situation will be waiting. The show cannot fix this. No show can. But Family Guy, by refusing to pretend otherwise, by allowing its characters to loop back to their worst behaviors episode after episode without offering the false comfort of permanent change, is at least being honest about what unresolved things look like from the inside. That honesty is not comfortable, but it is real. And in the soft dark of whatever hour you are watching from tonight, surrounded by the familiar voices and the rhythms of the show, that realness is something you can sit with. Section 22. What sleep does to the hidden messages. There is a particular quality to experiencing a show like Family Guy in this context, at night, with the volume low, with the intention of letting it drift around you rather than commanding your full attention. And it changes what the hidden messages do. When you are watching intently, tracking plot and character and joke structure, the messages compete with everything else for your attention. You process the comedy and the commentary and the satire simultaneously, and the experience is a busy one, a noisy one. You are actively receiving information from multiple layers at once and sorting it all as it arrives. In this state, in the quiet dark, with the show running in the background and your attention softening at its edges, something different happens. The jokes still land, the familiar voices still register, the rhythms of the show, the structure of the cutaways and the setups and the returns create a kind of sonic texture that is comforting in its familiarity. And underneath all of that, without the pressure of active analysis, the messages settle in differently. They arrive at a lower frequency. They are felt rather than decoded. The argument about free speech in PTV becomes not an argument to be evaluated but a feeling about constriction and release. The grief in Brian and Stewie becomes not a plot point to be tracked but a warmth, a sense of two people in a closed space being honest with each other. The complexity of what the show was doing with Meg becomes a kind of low-grade sadness, the way complicated things sometimes feel when you are not trying to fully understand them. The show is still running its messages. The messages are still going somewhere. But in this state, they go somewhere softer, somewhere less analytical. And sometimes that is actually where a message lands most effectively. Not when you are interrogating it, but when you are receiving it without your defenses fully up. This is, in a way, what the ASMR context does for content like this. It strips away the urgency of active comprehension and replaces it with something more like presence. You are here. The show is here. The things the show has been trying to say across its entire run are here. And in the quiet between the jokes and the cutaways and the familiar musical cues, there is space for those things to settle and be felt rather than argued with. The hidden messages of Family Guy were made for an audience paying full attention. But some of them, the ones about loneliness and purpose and the difficulty of being a person in a family that does not quite see you, work equally well for an audience that is letting go. Maybe they work better. Maybe the distance of half-sleep strips away the irony that the show sometimes used to protect itself from fully meaning what it said, and you get to the thing underneath more directly. The talking dog who keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because some days the weight of his life is more than he knows how to carry. The baby who built weapons to avoid admitting he did not know who he was. The girl who stood up for herself and then decided that her family's stability was worth more than her own peace. The creator who expressed his rage at censorship through a cartoon and never let go of his belief that the things his show said deserved to be heard. All of it running quietly in the background. All of it still saying something. All of it waiting, as it always has been, for the person paying close enough attention to receive it. Closing and what you carry with you. Every episode we went through tonight was a version of the same basic story. A piece of television that was more than it appeared. A comedy that was also an argument. A cartoon that was also a portrait. A show that was often flawed, sometimes deeply so, that nonetheless kept reaching for something beyond pure entertainment, and sometimes, in its best moments, actually got there. The reason Family Guy at its best was worth watching is not the cutaways, though the cutaways could be brilliant. It is not the shock value, though the shock value was real and sometimes effective. It is not even the characters, though the characters in their early forms were genuinely original and genuinely loved. The reason Family Guy at its best was worth watching is that it was made by people who thought the comedy of everyday American life was a meaningful subject, that the frustrations and fears and absurdities of working-class existence deserved to be on television and to be taken seriously even while being laughed at, and who believed, most of the time, that their audience was smart enough to receive both levels of what they were offering simultaneously. That belief is worth honoring, even when the show failed to live up to it, even when the gap between what it was trying to say and what it actually communicated was painful. The attempt itself, the consistent, decades-long attempt to do something with the format beyond simply filling time, is what gives the show its permanent interest. You have been listening for a long time tonight. The messages have been running quietly underneath everything else, and now you can let them settle. Let the show keep playing if it is still running. Let the voices continue in the background while you drift toward whatever comes next. It is all still there when you come back to it. The first episode, the band one, the vault, the storm, the girl who put down her anger to keep her family together, the dog who kept a secret that was too heavy to carry alone until the right person happened to be trapped in the same room. They are still saying what they always were. You just had to be quiet enough to hear it. If this is the kind of deep dive that settles something in you, leave a like on this video so more people can find it. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribe. It is completely free and you will not miss what comes next. Sleep well.